I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the name Niccolo Machiavelli. He was a 15th century statesman who wrote the principles of statecraft for his prince. The problem with what he wrote, although they were very practical principles, very effective principles, is that they weren't ethical. So that, for instance, he told his prince that if you have an enemy and you have the power to lop off his head, you do that. If you don't have the power, then you got to make nice and negotiate and explain to him how moral it is to love your enemies. And well, as you can imagine, the church put this book on its list of reading. In the 20th century, a man named Saul Alinsky took Machiavelli's principles of statecraft, but he rewrote them not for a prince, but for radical organizers, to put at the service of what he called the have-nots. He had a socialist worldview. He saw the world in terms of divisions of class that were in perpetual war with one another. Also, to help what he called the have-nots, he created called people's organizations, which his radical organizers would use somewhat in the unions were being used, but in neighborhoods, to identify people who could be local leaders and to help rally folks to fight for progressive political causes. He wrote 2 books about his organizing principles, and of course there's a lot of information in there, but I want to draw your attention to 3 points. One was that he wrote that in war, and by extension in politics, the ends justify just about any means. You see his relationship to Machiavelli in this. He taught moral relativism, that the organizer does not have a fixed truth. To him, the truth is relative and changing. He also wrote that an organizer must do what he can with what he has, and then clothe it in moral garments. That one is also very Machiavellian, and it led Saul Alinsky to develop relationships with religious institutions because they provided his organizers with the immediate, instantaneous moral garment that they needed. Once he had a church on board, he had human respect. So by 1940, Alinsky needed a way to finance his people's organizations. And so he created something called the Industrial Areas Foundation. Often it goes by the acronym, the IAF. And this became the national umbrella for all of his different local affiliates. Each of the local affiliates has its own name. So in Albuquerque, where I'm from, our local Industrial Areas Foundation affiliate is called Albuquerque Interfaith. If you went to Los Angeles, it would be called 1LA. And here in Virginia, it's called Virginians Organized for Interfaith Community Engagement. The acronym is VOICE, and that's in the Arlington Diocese here. There are about 60 of these local affiliates around the country, and there are some in other countries as well. One of the things that the IAF did was to train more organizers. Many of those organizers remained within the IAF network, but some of them went out to found their own networks. So there's Gamaliel and DART and Interfaith Worker Justice and National People's Action and a whole bunch of others. And all these networks have their own affiliates with their own names, which can become very confusing. But the point to remember is that they all have that same Alinskian foundation. They're all using the same methodology, and they all have the same ultimate political goals. This shows a map of Virginia, and you can see where some of the organizations are around the state. I have green for IAF, pink for Gamaliel, white for DART, blue for Interfaith Worker Justice. And I have to say that in Virginia, you're not a profoundly organized state. If you went to California, you would see scores of these. This next slide shows pretty much the same information in a different form. These are the actual names of the affiliates, arranged by network. And the names will change. You might get one name during the organizing phase, another name during when it gets established. They might reorganize and name it still again. They also will have names for the projects that they do, or for the Industrial Areas Foundation has been very much involved in education reform, which has been unpopular since the 90s because it involves a pedagogy and a nationalization of education, which is problematic. So the Industrial Areas Foundation has been part of the public engagement component for getting people to accept this kind of reform. And so it will organize in the schools to give the appearance of parental support and then strut them out in front of the media. But that gives you an idea of what's here. As I said, Alinski's motive in creating the Industrial Areas Foundation was so that he could raise money for his people's organizations. The money would come from individual philanthropists, it would come from secular foundations, it also came from religious institutions. As a Catholic, I was particularly interested in how the Catholics were getting money into these organizations and discovered that around 1970, a number of Alinskian trained priests persuaded the bishops that we needed a poverty fund, which they called the Campaign for Human Development. In reality, a very small percentage of that fund had money that went into what I would think of as a human development project, economic development project. The majority of it went into political advocacy, and of that, most of it into Alinskian organizing. Today, they get about half of the money that's collected by the CHD into Alinskian organizing. They had a great slogan. The slogan was that they were going to end the vicious cycle of poverty. But as I say, most of the money is going to political advocacy. There is also an educational component to the Campaign for Human Development. There always has been. And that educational component has always pushed the people who went through its programs in the direction of liberation theology. The current iteration is something called Just Faith. The program changes a little bit each year. It operates on the basis of a reading list, which has some Catholic reading in there, some solid Catholic reading in there. But usually that reading is taken out of context. And most of it is either non-Catholic or nominally Catholic. The theology that supports it, or in the year that I did it at the study, which was 2011, 2012, as I said, it changes a little bit from year to year. But in that year, the theology that supported it was liberationist. The spirituality, when they had people come together to discuss the videos and books that they were reading, it wasn't Catholic. And among the other things that it was pushing was this Alinskian organizing. I don't want to leave you with the impression that Catholics are the only religious supporters of this. Every mainstream denomination has a poverty fund, similar to the CHD fund, where it raises money ostensibly to help the poor, but in reality it's going into this political advocacy. There is a wonderful, horrible line in The Coercive Utopians, which was written in the 80s by two men who I don't believe were Catholic. And he quotes a Presbyterian minister who was involved in their Presbyterian funding, where he says, "Oh, when those little old ladies in their tennis shoes find out what we're doing." No. I don't want to leave you with the impression either that this is about money. Money is in a certain way the least of it. The problem is that you have certainly factions within churches, and in some cases entire denominations that are losing their foundational theology and supplanting it with this politicized theology. The Presbyterian Church USA and the Evangelical Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, a few years ago signed a joint document that all of their congregations belong to these Alinskian organizations. And they recommended that their seminarians be trained in organizing. That's really a very fundamental theological and ecclesial shift. Coming back to the Catholic Church, in the 70s, early 70s, these Alinskian trained priests persuaded the bishops that in anticipation of the bicentennial, the 1976 200-year anniversary of our country, that we needed to hold hearings around the country and to learn what the Catholic people thought about things. So there were 6 of these hearings set up, and each hearing was on a different topic. So there was education and human sexuality, national politics, international politics, that sort of thing. Anyone could come to talk. It didn't matter if you were heterodox or orthodox in your thinking. It didn't matter if you were liberal or conservative. Everybody was welcome to testify. But the ones collecting the testimony were the organizers. And so they prepared 8 position papers that supposedly reflected what the Catholic people thought, and it only reflected a progressive agenda. Among the recommendations that these 8 position papers had were that every parish, Catholic parish, support a competent ecumenical neighborhood action group, and the diocesan resources would be used to train local leadership. Other position papers proposed that the Church establish priorities for public policy, that it define major election issues, that it educate the laity on the moral dimension of these public issues, and that it implement these goals ecumenically. Still, other position papers contain specific challenges to church structure, church discipline, and church dogma. And then in 1976, they organized a media event that was designed to really sock it to the bishops. So they brought in progressives from all over the country to ratify these papers. These were the demands of the people, the call to action demands of the people. Well, in reality, it only represented the Alinskians. I could have picked a lot of faces to represent this call to action movement. This is just one out of many. This is Monsignor Jack Egan. He was from Chicago, a longtime friend of Saul Alinsky's. He trained in Alinskian organizing. He helped Saul Alinsky navigate the Chicago Archdiocese. He was on the board of the Industrial Areas Foundation. He was one of the organizers involved with this first call to action conference. And he remained involved with call to action until his death in 2001. Obviously, the bishops were in no position to accept these demands from call to action. But the fact is, we're now, 40 years down the road. Hundreds of Catholic parishes around the country are members of these Alinskian groups. Decades later, the USCCB does push specific public policy. In fact, their meeting in just a few weeks is going to be to decide, one of its jobs is to decide what the next 10-year policy priorities are. And there's quite a division among the bishops right now as to whether it's going to go in the direction of pro-life and family values or in other directions. It does coordinate this push for public policy ecumenically, largely through these Alinskian groups. It does provide talking points and backgrounders. If you go to the USCCB, that's the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops website, you can download on any of their priority public policies, priorities. You can download the backgrounders, the talking points. So the call to action resolution to politicize the Catholic Church is being realized in this country, much as it's been realized among the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the U.S. Presbyterian Church. Now, just one more sort of interesting point about how these groups organize. These are the members of VOICE. This is your Arlington-based IAF affiliate. If you look at it closely, you'll see that all of its members represent congregations. So they're all institutions, and they're all congregational institutions. So we call this kind of an organization faith-based organizing. The Gamaliel and Dart's Virginia affiliates are also faith-based. They're also comprised of religious congregations. This is a slide that shows the member institutions of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. This is an affiliate of the Interfaith Worker Justice Network. This one, it does also have congregations, but it also has unions, and it has political groups, such as the Soros-funded Center for American Progress, among other things. So we would call this a broad-based organization. And in my part of the country, it also includes schools. So that's it. I'm not going to talk anymore about how these groups are structured. I'd like to focus for the remainder of the talk on 4 concerns that I have with this kind of organizing. And the first concern is that it's not ethical. The second concern is that it isn't grassroots. The third concern is that its orientation is statist, that if you have a social problem, they're going to be looking to the government to solve that problem. And in the context of their organizing within religious institutions, there is a very strong element of this liberation theology, liberationism. It's called different things in Protestant circles, and we'll get to that in a minute. And that it networks for progressive political purposes. Now, the way I'm speaking about it, it sounds like these are 4 very distinct elements, but that division is for the purposes of being able to talk about it. They overlap a lot. I've already touched on the unethical foundation of this organizing in Saul Alinsky's thought, but I'd like to make a couple of additional points. And one is that these networks don't repudiate Alinsky. Many of them will recommend his work on their websites. But even where they don't openly acknowledge him or that expressing pride in that background, they use his methodology, perhaps not the more flamboyant methodology that he describes in Rules for Radicals, but certainly the more substantive ideology. So I can give you an example of something that I experienced myself. I'm sure that most of you have heard about base communities in Latin America. They were Marxist attempts to pull people who were not terribly well educated in the faith, but who were culturally and emotionally very attached to Catholicism. They would put them in communities where they didn't have a lot of access to their priests, and then take the religious elements that were meaningful to them, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Bible stories, and they would suck them of their religious content and then politicize them. Well, there were experiments with base communities in the United States as well. They went by different names here. Sometimes they were called base communities, but usually they went by names like small Christian communities, small faith communities, or the acronyms SCC, SFC. Well, Call to Action, which was really pushing this in the United States, anecdotally was finding that it wasn't doing here what it did in Latin America. So they had 2 of their associated academics do a study, and they wrote a book about it. And indeed, what they thought they were seeing, they were seeing. Now, when these small Christian communities were being formed in Protestant circles, they were pretty good from the call to action perspective. They were politically active. When they were intentional call to action communities, they were politicized. But the ones that were involved in the Catholic community remained very attached to their parishes. And the people who were involved in them not only knew their faith better than your average Catholic, but they believed what they were very committed to the church. Well, this was not what these people were looking for, and so they decided they were going to hold a conference to begin to re-educate the leadership of these small Christian communities in the Catholic Church, to start that politicizing of them. And so they held this conference with the stated mission to make the SCCs more socially aware and to engage them in activism. So the re-education began with speakers. And each speaker said in his or her own way that they were part of a small Christian community, which had been a really dull affair until they hooked up with their local, they didn't use the word Alinskian, but their local peace and justice group, their local advocacy group, however they worded it. And that suddenly everything had come alive and their people were engaged, and it was just a wonderful thing. So after a day of that, we held a guided scripture reflection in which we were told how important it was that the Christians not be turned inward with their spirituality, but they turn it outwards to the largest community and be engaged in service. You should have a picture now of the globe, I think, there. But of course, service didn't mean feeding the hungry. It meant joining one of these organizations. Then lastly, we were divided into caucuses. Each caucus had a facilitator who was part of it, and one of the organizers who was part of it. And we were given the task of coming up with 3 responses to what do we now see as the major work to foster the development of these SCCs. Oh my goodness, I guess my group was not educable, because these guys, they wanted better Bible studies, they wanted apologetic materials. They got the idea of service, but they were still interpreting it in terms of Catholic teaching. They had the 14 works of corporal and spiritual mercy. So again, they were willing to go out and feed the hungry, or counsel the doubtful, or visit the imprisoned. But there was nothing about political advocacy. So as it got down to 5 minutes before we had to hand in our 3 responses, the facilitator got up and she was very agitated. No one had challenged her, but she pointed to the board. She said, "I have a right to an opinion too, and I want to see you put down on that board that," and again, I don't remember the exact wording, but that we become socially engaged, that we join groups or whatever it was. And darn it, that became one of our 3 convocation responses, that's what we were demanding. We wanted it. And then, more interestingly enough, that became a convocation, this whole conference. That was one of our priorities, that we were going to organize our SCCs for public life, forging links with faith-based justice groups, emphasizing peace and justice issues. That tactic, that manipulation, is a cornerstone of Alinskian organizing. So if they need to get people out for that education reform, they know how to bring out the progressives. They work with the media. They know how to give the appearance of strong public support for whatever it is that they are trying to push. So point number 2 is that Alinskian organizations are not grassroots. Ernesto Cortez, who is the Southwest Regional Director of the Industrial Areas Foundation, many years ago wrote, "The organizer's issue gets dealt with last. If you want your issue," now he's talking to organizers, "if you want your issue to get dealt with first, they'll never build anything. So you lead with other people's issues. So your road has potholes. So what are you going to do about it? Who do you go see to fix that? If that person doesn't cooperate with you, how do we start to bring pressure on that person?" So you lead with other people's issues. You teach them how to act on their issues. And then you model what it is to be reciprocal. I helped you to fill those potholes. Now I need you to get your people out here and help me fight for this education program. You model what it is to have a long-term vision. That long-term vision, the organizer's issues that get dealt with last, that's the reason for the organization. If the neighborhood gets money to fix streets, then people are grateful to the organization. They've learned the process of civic action. They've learned to trust the organization. But that's not the organization's issue. That's the other people's issue. The organization's issue is to build political power for social change. And so we have to ask, what are we trying to change? Well, that brings us to the third objection of Alinskian organizing, and that's that it's statist. But before I go into the progressive political agenda, I want to step back and look at this within the context of a religious institution. Because religious institutions have their own agendas, which is to spread the gospel. Christ crucified and Christ risen. So in order to get the cooperation that you need, the involvement that you need, you've got to change how people think about church, think about religion. I can give you a couple examples of how this is done. So in San Antonio, the IAF there had the Catholics who were going through the leadership programs rewrite the Magnificat in the context of their daily concerns. Now the Magnificat, you know, is that beautiful hymn of praise that Mary says when she comes before Elizabeth. She's pregnant. Elizabeth is pregnant and the baby leaps in her womb, right? So I'm going to reread this rewritten, 2 lines from this rewritten Magnificat, which is now titled a manifesto. He stretches his powerful arms and liberates us from the clutches and snares of the power brokers, those who rob the afflicted and needy. He brings down bankers and developers, oil barons, and raises our barrios and ghettos. This is inculcating class warfare. This is diametrically opposed to the Catholic notion of solidarity among different class strata. And then I found a couple of local examples here in Virginia. One involved a pastor from Richmond. The DART affiliate there is called RISC, and I didn't write down what that stands for. Virginians, Richmonders Interfaith something. So anyway, he confuses church worship with political activism. And he writes, RISC became the vehicle for me and my congregation to begin to walk the walk. We talked about justice a lot, but we had not done justice. Now through RISC and DART, our people are experiencing a growing sense of empowerment and fulfillment. And then he gets all excited because he was able to turn out 1/3 of his congregation, or in terms of numbers, 1/3 of the number of people who usually came to Sunday worship. He got them to go to one of the RISC actions. And so he continues to write, we're already beginning to think of turning out for community action the same number of people we turn out for worship. How exciting. But an even more curious example comes from your local Voice. On its web page header, at the very top when you open up the web page, there's a slogan. And the slogan is, Virginians organized for interfaith community engagement, and that's VOICE, organizing for a new dominion of justice and political participation. New dominion is social gospel talk. That's like liberationism in the Protestant churches. One Protestant critic explains it as the conviction that Scripture gives the church a mandate to take dominion over this world socially and culturally before the bodily return of Jesus Christ. So Alinskians are twisting that kingdom of God into an earthly kingdom of their own making, which Jesus expressly tells us that we're not supposed to be doing. The Catholic Catechism of the Church, discussing this very part of the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, explains this too. I mean, of course Christians are supposed to be engaged in the world, but their work in the world isn't worldly work. By a discernment, I'm reading now from the Catechism, by a discernment according to the Spirit, Christians have to distinguish between the growth of the reign of God and the progress of culture and society in which they are involved. They're two separate things. The distinction is not a separation. The Christian vocation doesn't suppress, but actually reinforces his duty to put into action in this world the energies and means received from the Creator to serve justice and peace. And traditionally, this has been called Catholic action. And the first element of Catholic action was personal conversion. And the next element was evangelizing. From that, justice flowed. So lastly, there's this problem that Alinskian organizing is at the service of progressive social change. Statism in a Catholic country would be one thing. I mean, it would have its problems, but for instance, in Malta, now it's starting to change because they're losing their Catholic identity. But because it was a Catholic country, they had nationalized health care. And so you had health care available to everyone, but it didn't have abortion. It didn't have sterilization. It didn't have birth control. So that would be one thing. I mean, you could see that. But what we're looking at is a secularized statism. It's working to create big government-controlled education and workforce systems, universal health care, but where the foundation is secular, where the foundation isn't based on God's law. It isn't based on natural law. It's based on human consensus. And so we find that that system does indeed contain abortion and birth control and sterilization and euthanasia coming down the pipe. In order to coordinate the work of the Alinskian networks and spread progressive ideas, particularly among religious conservatives, there was a media machine created just before the 2008 election with George Soros money. Right before the election, they had a speakers bureau, and the speakers bureau consisted of many clergy, men and women, who ran, in addition to whatever their clerical duties were, they also ran organizations, some of which were to maintain abortion rights or to maintain or to advance homosexual rights. But the message that they coordinated together, this entire speakers bureau, that they were sending out to the papers, was that this election, this 2008 election, was not to be about these minor, unimportant social issues of abortion and homosexuality, but the big important issues, which were the economy. It was very effective. After the election, the Speakers Bureau disappeared, and this group, Faith and Public Life, went on to organize the publicity for the nuns in the bus. I don't know if you heard about them, but they were pushing for a very problematic budget. When they were trying to push the Affordable Care Act, they developed publicity, again, clergy doing the speaking, and targeted the more conservative parts of the country. And the message was, this is the Christian thing to do, some form of that. And then they have writers who write for not only the major publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but also that write for religious papers who are coming from a progressive mindset, but they know the language of the people for whom they're writing, and they can present the progressive message in a very unalarming way. It's a sophisticated business, and it's sophisticated on the local level too. So if you were to ask DART's affiliate in Charlottesville, which is called Impact, if they promote birth control or sterilization, they would say, no, of course not, that's not our issue. But those issues pervade their issues. For example, in 2010, 2011, Impact was working to expand a pre-K program around the states. Now, why on earth was Impact involved in expanding nursery schools? Because the pre-K program are not just about nursery schools. It's a comprehensive program. The goal is to cover each child from prenatal to grade. Actually, the goal is to eventually cover everybody until they retire. This involves indicators of school readiness at the child, family, school, and community levels. I'm reading now from one of the strategic plans. Tracking a child, his family, his school, and his community requires a lot of data. Interventions, to help with school readiness include everything and anything. Again, I'm quoting: parenting education, adult education, financial literacy, high-quality nutrition, healthcare for the child and his family. It's an extensive list. There's plenty in that about which to be concerned. But for the purposes of this discussion, I want to mention just one small element of this comprehensive package: Smart Beginnings. Smart Beginnings collaborates with a number of programs that are family planning providers. This is the house that Jack built. This is systemic change. It's complicated. The devil's buried in the details. But this is a secular package helping people to get all sorts of benefits. A Virginia Guide to Planning, Genetics, and Social Services begins by saying, and I'm going to quote, "Many people plan their families and space their children so that life can be healthier and more rewarding for each member of the family." And that's the message. Poor people are being told that what they need to make their children ready for school is to contracept. I wish I had more time. This is a complicated topic, but what I hope you take from this today is that politicizing religious congregations is a really clever Machiavellian idea. But it doesn't give the church more influence in society. It strips the church of whatever influence it might have had. Alinskian organizing, progressivism doesn't end the vicious cycle of poverty. It exacerbates it. And Alinskian organizing doesn't give the little guy more political clout. It makes him a pawn of the organization, and eventually it's going to make us all servants of the state.